My name is Rory O'Donnell. I'm Director of the National Economic and Social Council. Most of you know what that is, but for those of you who are visiting Ireland, it's an advisory body attached to the Prime Minister's office. And the council consists of representatives of trade unions, employers, farm organisations, community and voluntary sector, and as of next month, an environmental pillar. And because the effectiveness of our Secretariat's work for that council depends very much on our credibility and balance, I have to confine myself to some degree to commenting on the discussion from positions that the council has taken. But that does give me, I think, a fair ground on which to respond to this really fascinating discussion. Until about lunchtime, I was kind of keeping a track of speakers and indeed questioners, and with the sense that I might capture the actual narrative, but the waves washed over me, and that's collapsed. So the only way I think I can structure it is to say that, is in a sense to say we need to think in terms of levels: global, European, and in our case Irish. And some speakers raise the question of local as well, and that's valid. And the reason I think it's worth doing that is that the discussion has revealed very strongly that it's important to keep all of those levels in sight, so that we can see how global imbalances, global changes in economic strength and demography and power are really in play here and are at the back of some of these problems we face. And in fact, if Irish people didn't think about that very much, given, I feel like, our limited remit on the global stage, I think we see it now very clearly in that Ireland's recovery really does depend on an international, a global recovery, and now we're aware of the ambiguities and complexities which are preventing or at least qualifying the nature of the global recovery. Now, other speakers, Michael and Bruce and others, have, I think, touched very well on the global issues, the global imbalances, the fact that we're going through, I suppose, we're in the early stages of a change in global power and economic strength, and as in the past, an awful lot depends on how that's institutionalized, and indeed it depends on it being institutionalized at the global level, so that it's resolved through institutional creation and institutional reconfiguration rather than through conflict, which these kinds of imbalances can give rise to. So the rest of my comments, I will concentrate on Europe and Ireland. A second reason, I suppose, for thinking about these levels and keeping them all in view on the one hand, but separating them carefully as well, is that the policy possibilities, and indeed power, the policy possibilities are very different at different levels. And to put that more concretely, if there is a debate, and there is a debate between various schools of thinking of economic and social analysis, and if we think of one school being a kind of neoliberal view of markets will adjust automatically, etc., and another view which is in this room, and many others indeed adhere to it, and as many, I suppose, subversions of it, which is Keynesian and institutionalist in its perspective. Well, I think it's very important in Ireland that we think carefully about what parts of that institutionalist or Keynesian view or social view of the economy, what parts we can make operative at national level, and what parts can only be made operative at European or indeed global level. And I think there's and I suppose my own view is, and I come back to the possibility of an Irish fiscal stimulus towards the end of my remarks, is that we really need, and it's easy in a sense to latch on to Keynesian demand management especially to dust it off now, as it has to be dusted off, as if you like, the most visible piece of thinking available, ignoring that that view of the world has a lot of micro dimensions and institutional dimensions below the level of macro fiscal and monetary management, dimensions about the way labour markets are viewed and managed, the way market failures are addressed in innovation, in technology, in education, in social care, the way in which institutions are created, need to be created for involvement of people in solving problems. And I think, in a sense, what I'm driving at is, we in Ireland, I think, need to fish in that institutional pond of the non-macro part of political economy, in order to find things that we can really make work in a context where we have very limited macroeconomic levers. Not that they don't exist at European level, they do. And another interesting feature, in a way, of that contrast is that it is striking that if you take the very orthodox view, of the dominant neoliberal view of the last few decades, one interesting feature that isn't much mentioned is that sort of school of thought almost makes no distinction between countries, big, small, rich, poor, third world, first world. That is, you could, in that school of thinking, you can read off the right economic policies from the textbook, the Washington Consensus, and really they're the same. They're the same for huge countries and small countries, by and large. That is, they need to create a basic framework of law that allows markets to work, and then create institutions to stop anyone else interfering with, whether it's regulatory institutions or other institutions. And that's really the same in that way of thinking for every country, wherever they are. But if you go over to the other way of thinking, which is more Keynesian, more institutional, etc., then in fact that way of thinking differs perhaps more than anything in saying that the institutions, the policies that need to be created do differ between, and that can be created, do differ between big countries, small countries, middle-sized countries, countries embedded in a system of international law like the European Union, countries that are not, and that are, have different geopolitics. So that's, I think, an interesting thing, that this way of thinking that dominates the room. I think inherent in it is the need to explore context and context-specific needs, and that I think is important. So let me turn then to Europe. I think there's definitely a sense, and this, I don't know how much comfort it is, but this crisis is clearly on the same scale as the 1930s. We know in the 1930s in Europe that crisis gave rise to vicious divisions between countries, vicious divisions within countries between social classes, and the construction of Europe in the last 50 years pretty much guarantees that we won't revert to open conflict between countries, and the development of institutions of partnership, social dialogue, or whatever within countries gives us some reassurance anyway that this crisis won't force a reversion to open war, hostility between social classes and economic groupings within countries. The exception might be maybe ethnic minorities within countries, but that is like, in a sense, we should really be thankful that, given that this thing has happened, that Europe has been created. It offers so much. Now, of course, that doesn't solve our harder problems. And then turning to the issue of Europe and Ireland in Europe, we published a report in August in the National Economic and Social Council on the euro and Ireland's problems within the euro, and that report is deliberately quite wide-ranging and looked back over the history and design of the euro to begin with, and the expectations. And what is interesting, if you look at the expectations of the euro, is that the discussion over 10, 15, 20 years was very broad. I mean, almost all the things that could go wrong were mentioned in the discussion. This is not to sort of point back and say that so-and-so told you so, or because the euro we got was the only euro we could get. I mean, an openly Keynesian euro was not feasible at the time of the creation of the euro. And so the design is pretty near to the only design that you could imagine politically. But certainly it is worth looking back at the expectations. That the discussion was very rich and is full of things we can use now. For example, Kenneth Dyson, the British political economist, identified the following. He said that the euro, and he's actually a German scholar, so he's very clear, more than anybody, clear about what was and what wasn't possible in the design of the euro. But he made the point in 2000, so a full 10 years ago, that if we were to imagine a change in economic context, a radical change from the context that prevailed in the end of the 1990s, when the fear was of fiscal deficits, and imagine a switch from that economic context, he said, for example, to a Keynesian crisis with the danger of a liquidity trap, then the question would be what is the ability of the euro to think intelligently and reform itself in the face of a change of context? And I think those observations are really very, very prescient. They're not based on a critique of the euro or a critique of what was done, but they're a question of the ability of this remarkable set of institutions to exercise of governance. And the most remarkable are the ones, in my view, which are not the highly centralized ones, but which involve the setting of framework goals, allowing a very significant degree of decentralized implementation of member states and indeed agencies in member states, apply those framework goals as they see fit, but then there's a duty and a process for reporting and benchmarking and reflecting on success and failure, and then an ability to revise the framework in the light of that. And this exists in many areas of the internal market. You referred to the REACH directive. It exists in the remarkable structures of the water framework directives. It exists in medicines. It exists in aspects of health and safety. It exists to a degree, no one's quite so satisfied with it, in employment and social inclusion. So this process of, as agreed framework goals, decentralized, non-directive, actually directives, but framework directives, but non-instructive implementation, but then learning, mutual learning. And what's striking is that Europe didn't bring this remarkable invention, and it's not only evident in Europe, it's evident in many aspects of the world, didn't bring it to bear in two areas of particular significance to us now: financial regulation and economic coordination. In both of those spheres, and our own central bank governor now, writing in 1999, I think, writing after the Maastricht Treaty, said you'd have to worry that the degree of financial regulation at European level will be insufficient and too much is being left at national level, based on his knowledge of the kind of savings and loans difficulties in the United States and that. So Europe didn't bring to the financial regulation and economic coordination the kinds of governance procedures it has created and made so effective in aspects of the internal market, many aspects of environmental protection, health and safety, employment. Maybe it's a bit debatable, but certainly that. And so that's very striking. And in fact, what happened, I think, was that the member states, having agreed the Maastricht Treaty and then created the euro, instead of seeing their deliberate ceding of sovereignty in monetary policy, that was the conscious decision to the European Central Bank, instead of seeing that deliberate loss of sovereignty as a reason to engage more fully with each other in those areas where they retain power, the Lisbon strategy, economic coordination, reforms, etc., they actually saw it as a reason to reassert sovereignty in those other areas. In other words, they met the independence of the central bank with their own reassertion of independence in the economic area and many other areas. And so we know the Stability and Growth Pact was, despite some successes, was in many ways deeply disappointing in its outcomes. And in a sense, this reflects, and our reporter argued this, I think it's important, not just technical flaws. There are clearly technical flaws begging in the Stability and Growth Pact, and I think several speakers referred to them. The arbitrariness of particular numbers, etc. But the failure reflects that. But in fact, a technical flaw won't trip you up if you're really intent on making something work. In many ways, it's the limited buy-in to the euro as a project of stabilisation, of prosperity, and of international governance. A lack of buy-in by Europe's political leaders, and in a sense its peoples. The father of monetary economics, Robert Mundell, said just before the euro was launched that the biggest effect of the euro will be to change the mindset of Europeans. And this is like a technical economist of great status, making this very interesting psychological observation. It turns out that he was wrong. It hasn't changed the mentality of Europeans. And so the issue of buy-in is really very critical. And this brings me then to the question of the Stability and Growth Pact and the reform process. And I have to say, I almost cheered when Pervenche mentioned this issue of diagnostics. It's quite clear that Europe this year had to achieve a step increase in the degree of economic coordination, given the failures of over a decade. A reform process was put in place. Our argument in August was it's very important that reform process is open enough and searching enough to address whatever problems come up. The immediate ones have come up in terms of Greece and risks to the euro during the middle of this year, and the need for the European Central Bank to kind of be pragmatic and depart from the script to some degree, and it has. We know that you'd have to share underlying worries about whether the Greek arrangement can work out, whether the fiscal strategies can work out, whether the banking system at European and global level is really resolved. But if one names those worries, and you have to, then the critical thing is that Europe, the reform process, is open enough to continue addressing them as they emerge. And I think the critical thing is what Pervenche said, of that the economic coordination has to be diagnostic enough to uncover the problems. And we know from Spain and Ireland that Ireland and Spain could conform easily to the Stability and Growth Pact, both the 3% and the 60%, up to 2007, and still, under the surface, was a growing structural deficit of major proportions. So clearly, the diagnostics weren't sufficient to uncover that. And I'll say a bit more about that in a moment. Of the Europe 2020 and fiscal coordination, I think it's absolutely critical that both strategies go forward, and there's a real risk to either of them if one of them is abandoned, I think. Turning into Ireland, I think in many ways the fiscal debate as the day went on sort of settled down, I think, around a view, but maybe this is not the case, but I was very struck by Paul Sweeney saying that in many respects Ireland has limited capacity for an actual fiscal stimulus. So, but it is true that you could cut too hard, but that shouldn't, I think, be mixed up with the global intellectual debate about Keynesianism versus automatic stabilisation. I don't think it is a version of that debate. It's important, absolutely critical, but it's not that debate. And in some ways, we need to recognise that, because we won't think clearly if we don't. And I think, to finish, what I think we're confronted with, and this touches on the issue, of this fiscal council. In our analysis of Ireland's problems in the euro, what we concluded was that those problems reflected two different kinds of things, correlated things. Technical uncertainties about what part of the growth of revenue was based on the secular growth of the Irish economy as a region, what part was based on an economic cycle and what part was based on a bubble. And that's a tricky technical exercise to say, today, where are we? Are we in a growth phase, a cycle, 3 to 5 year cycle, or a bubble? But behind that were unresolved political economy issues about the size of the state, the nature and level of taxation, the nature of public services, how we would meet land and housing need and land. And the bubble of revenue created by the housing boom allowed these underlying unresolved political economy issues to be missed and ignored. So that, in example, in the last 10 years, one group could believe we were building the ultimate low-tax island because we were cutting taxes, and another group could believe we were finally building the Irish public services that we never had, for disability, for literacy support, health, etc. And in a sense, both sides were correct. We were doing both these things, but the sums didn't add up under the surface. And so the lesson of that is that a fiscal council might help, but behind it we have to enhance our ability to resolve these distributional and structural differences, which is what gives rise to bad fiscal policy in the first place. And so, as Michael said, it's a real challenge in a way to our political economy and institutions. Thank you.
It's been an extraordinarily absorbing and intense day, I think, and therefore very tiring. So I know everybody is anxious to wrap up and move on. But the first thing I want to do is to thank all of the speakers. If I can go to get a list, because I forget. I'm going to start with the last, which was Rory O'Donnell, because that was a fairly masterful, I think, analysis, and it was really hard to stay on top of that discussion all day long, and then to bring his own take on it from his own experience. So I think that was really wonderful. But then I also want to thank our partners, FEPS and Francois Serle, who started off the day, Paul Sweeney, Larry Michel, Stephanie Griffith-Jones, Pervenche Beret, Michael O'Sullivan, Bruce Campbell, and that's it. And I want to ask you all to just thank them for the It's been a really important day for TASC. It's been a huge intellectual resource for us in the organisation, but I think also for what we now call the wider TASC community, all the people who interact with us and connect with us and contribute. And I think it's just been really huge, because there was the sharing of really deep knowledge and from a base of shared values. And I think that was not only informative, but it was really, certainly from my perspective, really heartening. So I think it's, as I say, been an extremely important day for us. Huge number of ideas that we'll take away and build into our own programme, and I hope all of you will be able to take as well. One strong political message, I suppose, rather than any more economics today, that I took, and that is, I suppose, the challenge of generating a really serious discussion about an alternative to the neoliberal model. I mean, it's only 6 months since we came up with this title, Towards Recovery, and I think as people have been commenting during the day, maybe that was a tad optimistic as a title. I think Tom was talking about that the discussion is really about extreme austerity versus maybe ordinary austerity. And that's really serious in the sense of how do we shift it from that. And I think the kind of arguments that Larry was pointing out about the whole difficulty of the political obstacles that we face, and the one I think that struck me is that really difficult one of how you generate public understanding and public debate about a real one about a genuine alternative. And that's a challenge that we face as kind of a solitary progressive think tank in Ireland all the time, and we're kind of aware that we have to really seriously up our game if we're going to have any real impact. And I suppose my final point I'd make about that is that while we do have to really up our game, it's really important for us to have all of the think tanks represented here. That's been a huge additional thing for us as well. So we have, I think, 5 or 6 progressive economic think tanks from across Europe and North America working with us, and that gives us some, I think, optimism for going forward. So the last thing is that we have another whole day tomorrow. We have a huge number of additional people and a huge number of additional speakers. So if you can manage to wake up again in the morning after today, I hope you'll join us, and we'll go again one more time. But in the meantime, have a very good evening, and thanks very much for coming.